Plant propagation is the process of creating new plants. There are two types of propagation, sexual and asexual. We'll be focusing primarily on asexual reproduction in this course, which is also called vegetative propagation and is most popular in the home. This technique uses just one plant's stems, roots, and/or leaves. All you'll need is one healthy plant that's available to propagate, and we'll be able to multiply it into many other plants. Sounds fun and a bit magical, right? How do we choose a healthy plant? First, I like to make sure that the plant is watered at least 24 hours beforehand. Because we're making cuttings, we want to make sure that the plant is set up with as many resources as possible. This isn't always the case. In the case of division, I don't need the soil to be very wet. But I've got a couple of plants here that are healthy and they're actively growing and would be perfect to propagate. So this is a begonia Sophie Cecile, and as you can see, there's a bunch of new growth points. And this is a really good indicator of whether or not you would propagate a plant. Because this plant is actively growing, I know that it has more success when I cut it, and it has to create new roots. Here's another plant that I would say is really healthy. It's got a couple of active growth points. It may look a little bit crispy from being dried out a couple of times, but still, it's a healthy plant and we'd be able to divide it easily. This is one that I maybe wouldn't water 24 hours beforehand, because once I divide it and put it into new pots, we'll be able to water it then. Here's an example of two Rhaphidophora tetraspermas. One, unfortunately, has a nitrogen deficiency, and you can tell because of the chlorotic leaves, which means they are neon green. And this is missing one of the most important building blocks. But this plant here is not. So I would feel a lot more comfortable propagating from this plant that's healthy, as opposed to this plant that we may not be setting up with the appropriate resources. I'll probably fertilize this a bit more, and then once the coloring comes back and the plant looks healthy, then I would feel comfortable making a chop. Finally, we have my Monstera Adansonii, and yes, it does look like it's very healthy and it's doing well, but I have seen thrips on it a couple of times. I don't like to propagate plants that have bugs because we're again not setting them up for their best life possible. If a plant has been attacked and its foliage isn't as strong, then when you propagate it, it's less likely to live as well. This being said, if your plant is under attack with bugs, I do like to attempt sometimes propagation in order to have a backup plant in case this plant dies. What I would do is I would take a cutting and I will check each leaf to make sure that there's no bugs. Sometimes even if there's a couple, I'll wipe them away, but I'll make sure to continuously check on the plant. Because when you make a cut and you put it into soil, water, or any other medium, the plant goes under a little bit of stress. It's actually more likely to be affected by the bugs. So just keep that in mind, but it's always best to experiment. After we've finished propagating our plants, we'll have to care for them in our home. One of the most important things to consider is lighting. When you're rooting a plant and it doesn't have as many roots attached to the soil, it's not able to bring up as much water. Therefore, if we had really bright light on it, then the plants are likely to lose their water through the foliage. So we need to keep these in enough light to grow roots, but not too much light that it will dry out the plants before it can make roots. That being said, once you see that the plant has new growth and you feel like it's able to uptake water, you can start to put it into more sunlight. Another exception to this rule are cacti and succulents, and anything that loves and can handle a lot of sun. I propagated both of these in full sunlight outside and they could handle it. You can experiment with different levels of light and see how the plant reacts. So if this plant was getting too much light, you would see some of the leaves dry out, crisp up, and fall off. We typically propagate in the springtime because this is a really good time to cut back foliage when there's plenty of growing season left for it to grow new roots and prepare for a cold, dark winter. I like to put these plants in windows that are getting just a little bit of sunlight, but not too much direct sunlight and not too much harsh sunlight. So I like to avoid south and west facing windows and kind of err on the side of north and east where you're getting a lot of the morning sun, something that's a little more dappled and gentler. If you do want to grow in the winter, it's very beneficial to supplement the lighting. Again, we're going to try and get bright indirect light as opposed to direct sunlight. So you don't want the grow lights too close to the plant, but maybe about a foot over them. I'll show you a few examples of what I have. This is a bar LED grow light. It would be perfect placed about this high. Within a foot, we'll do a nice bright indirect light and not burn the foliage. This is on a timer and it's perfect because you can set it up for 14 plus hours a day and just leave it. This will recreate the growing season in your home and you won't have to miss a beat propagating. I've got another LED light from IKEA that can just be hung from the ceiling. Again, within a foot would be a perfect amount of lighting and you'd be able to grow all winter long. The second building block we'll focus on is water. I have 3 of the same plant here. It's all a bunch of philodendron white princesses. So I have one that I propagated in a soil, coco coir, and perlite mix. I have another one in a jar of perlite and another beaker full of moss. The moss just needs to be kept moist but not too wet, and don't let it dry out too much as well. You're keeping it at a nice medium level of moisture. It will also keep a lot of air around the roots if you propagate in moss, so it's a really great medium. I like to keep it filled up with water maybe around the bottom third of the jar, and the water will actually rise through capillary action. I think we even have some root growth. See, the perlite will attach to the roots. I find these two a lot easier to maintain because you really can visually see when the water's running out and then just fill it back up again. Whereas if I'm watering these plants in soil, I really need to put my finger in and check and see how the soil is doing. Is it moist? Is it dry? This is a little propagation, so there won't be too many roots in the soil yet. That means that the soil will stay wet for longer and you won't have to water it as much. But it will be a more frequent watering as roots fill up the pot and it's able to uptake this water. This is the mother plant that I took these off of. So originally the plant was about a foot tall, and at that point in time it had a lot more foliage to uptake the water. Now it really only has this one leaf. It's not photosynthesizing as much, and so I'm not watering it as frequently as well. This is a little string of pearls I've got in a humidity dome. This dome will stop evaporation from happening as much, and you really don't need to water the plant as frequently. It will also encourage root growth. So when you have a plant in this environment, keep in mind that it's staying a lot more moist than usual. I wouldn't put a cactus or a succulent in here because it really gets humid and it would encourage that to rot, whereas something that has more tender foliage will need more humidity supplement because they're more likely to lose water through their foliage. Whereas succulents and cacti, that's their nature. They hold water in their leaves, so too much humidity might encourage them to rot. So here is 4 stages of my fishbone cactus. So I can explain to you how I would water each of these. This one here was just propagated and the soil stays very wet on its own because there's no roots. And the only way that the water is leaving the soil is through evaporation. So naturally I have to water it a lot less. I'll use my moisture meter and I'll let it get down to maybe 1/3 of the way dry, and then I'll water it again. Usually I let this plant pretty much dry out, but I don't want to let the soil dry out too much. If you think about it, this plant's only going to start growing roots at the bottom of the stem. So if we're waiting for this entire pot to dry out, the area right near the roots is going to be dry a lot faster than anything deep in the middle of the soil. So you might risk killing off the roots that dry out. That's why we're keeping this a little bit more wet than we would something that's even a bit more developed. So this plant will have had roots maybe partially halfway down this pot. And so I let this one dry out even more than I would let this one because it has more root growth. Something that's nice to do is a lot of water propagation where you can see roots forming and start to visualize what this would look like underneath the soil, because it's a bit harder when it's under the soil and you don't want to disturb them too much. And then finally, this plant is established enough that I really do let it go, get near or fully dried out. And one that has been growing for a while, I'm back to watering as per usual as well, so I let it dry out between waterings. The growth of this fishbone cactus, these little cuttings will stay the same. They won't keep growing, but they will keep doing offshoots, and that's a lot of plants. So if you were to do a cutting of a snake plant, put it into water, that would not keep growing, but it would send out little offshoots, sort of like our Pilea peperomioides, where it sets off little offsets. So when you see little growth coming out, this is perfect. That's exactly what you're looking for, and you'll keep getting this growth everywhere. In my watering can, I've got a mixture of Pro-Mix fertilizer and water, which I have followed the back of the box's instructions, but also cut in half so that it's at a 10-10-10 ratio. I would water a plant that's fully grown with the usual 10-10-10 every couple of weeks. But when the plant hasn't formed its roots and is not mature, it really doesn't want or need this amount of fertilizer. When I first propagate a plant, I really don't need to give it much fertilizer, as it has enough nutrients stored within itself to sustain its life. I really don't even start fertilizing until I can see some active growth and I do believe that roots have filled the pot. Then I'll start to fertilize, and even then I'll start off really light. So say my fertilizer is a 10-10-10 mix, I'll cut it in half again and just use 5-5-5 on something that's just started growing and start to build up the fertilizer in the soil. You just don't want to burn the roots, so don't go heavy on the fertilizer until the plant is a lot larger. Here I have 4 different propagations, which I have started in mediums that have no inherent nutrients, which means there's no NPK value, no nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, or any other micro or macronutrients. Again, they have enough energy and resources stored within them to be fine without this fertilizer. They have enough nutrients in them to grow roots and to start their new life cycle, but you'll want to eventually transfer it into soil that does have nutrients, because it won't be able to continue its life for too long. You'll start to see nutrient deficiencies, like the plant will turn yellow and stop growing properly if you've kept it in for too long. One of the easiest forms of propagation is division. This is the one form where I like to keep the plant soil a little bit drier than usual before propagating it, because we're not actually cutting into the foliage, stems, petioles, and so we don't need to set the plant up with as much water. It's nicer to have soil that's a bit on the drier side because it won't become as much of a mess. So when I'm dividing a plant, I like to make sure to kind of work with gravity instead of tugging at the plant. So you can get your hands in, loosen up the soil, and start to work the plant out of its pot. See, that was easy. And there we go. Now, you can kind of see there are a few different sections in here. There's actually a couple of different plantlets. I'm just going to break off a piece because I want to trade it with a friend. Because it's quite natural for me to break off this little side section, as there's a gap, I'm going to try and break this apart in a firm yet gentle manner. Go. I'm just working my hands through what I feel is kind of a natural division in the roots and just working them apart. There is a part where I think I'm going to have to break or use my pruning shears. I'm going to cut this area in here. Oh, perfect. Whew, nice. Yeah, they were just attached by rhizomes. So I'm going to use a little bit of the soil from before. Drop it in. And fill in the pot. While the roots are settling for the next few days, you may see the plant show signs of shock, which is maybe some limp leaves. But don't worry, it will come back. And don't be afraid to give it a little bit of pressure when you're packing in the soil. And why we water it in is to just help those roots settle. There we go. And I like to choose a pot that's roughly about a half an inch to an inch larger than the root mass. And that will give it enough room to sit in the pot without drowning in too much soil. I'm not going to take any more divisions, so I'm just actually going to put the plant back in its original pot. Drop it in. And fill the plant in. I like to clean up some of the dead foliage while we're here, maybe give it a little bit of a prune, and take off anything that seems no longer beneficial to the plant. And again, I'll give this plant a nice water in. I'm gonna water this in until I can see all of the soil has been saturated, and even then, I'm comfortable with water coming out the bottom of the pot. After that's occurred, the soil will be holding the amount of water that it needs to be. It won't be oversaturated. Anything excess will run out the bottom of the pot. So just make sure to remove that water and don't leave it stagnant. Another popular plant that can be divided are snake plants. So this just used to be one plant, and now I have 3 of them. Pilea peperomioides is a perfect example of propagation through offsets. The plant will send out little babies throughout the soil through rhizomes. So I had one that I've taken out previously here, and it's actually already growing roots. I'm going to leave this one in water for quite some time until the roots get a lot longer, and then I'll transfer it to soil. I don't like to switch the propagation technique halfway through because it's actually growing water roots instead of soil roots right now. But if I took one from the soil here and wanted to just plant it into my mixture, I would take my shears. I'm going to cut on the rhizome, and off comes a little offset. Now I like to remove some of the petioles and foliage from the bottom just to give it some room where I'll put it underneath the soil. So I just have a mixture of potting mix and a little bit of extra perlite for added drainage, and I'm sticking this little guy in. Next, I'll water the plant in. The plant will now grow roots like the one in water here, but it will grow soil roots instead of water roots. Essentially, we're doing the same thing, but different mediums. Stem cuttings is one of the most popular ways of asexual reproduction because it's so easy to perform in the home, especially when you have a vining plant such as this heartleaf philodendron. I actually noticed that there's a bare node on the plant. So usually what you want to do is find a node that you're going to stick in either soil, moss, water, or another medium, and you would usually remove the leaf off of it, but since this one is already missing, I'm definitely going to use this as a point to start from. So I'll make a cut a little bit below the node on the internode. It's best to do it at 45 degrees. There we go. And you can just simply throw this in any medium of your choice. So I'm gonna drop this one in water. There's actually a bunch of bare nodes. So what I'm going to do is I'm gonna take a few more cuttings. I'm just removing this internodal section, which is essentially useless, and if I were to keep this on, would most likely rot. You don't want to take the cutting too close to the node, because if it does slightly rot, you can make another cut and take off the rotted section. But if you cut too close to the node, then you risk it rotting. We can take single node cuttings and actually keep the leaf on. So what I'll do here is make an incision, and this one little node cutting with the leaf on it will actually root up as well. So I'm gonna choose a little bit of potting mix, coconut coir, some extra perlite, and throw this cutting in. If you get a bunch of cuttings like this, then you can fill out the top of this plant and it will become really bushy. The risk with a single node cutting is that you have a higher likelihood of the node rotting and you will lose this leaf, but we can also do triple node cuttings. There we go, and I will take off this internodal section again, and this one maybe put into the wet sphagnum moss. So the good thing about taking a couple node cuttings or even a few nodes is that each of these sections has the opportunity to root and grow new foliage. So I'll just remove some, drop this in, surround it with moss, and this has a high likelihood of rooting up. I mentioned earlier that there's a misconception with Hoya leaves in propagating them into new plants. Fiddle leaf figs are another plant where a lot of people think that just the leaf can create a new plant. Unfortunately, it can't, but succulents have the wonderful ability of being able to use leaves as completely new starters for brand new plants. I have this sedum burrito here. Every time that a leaf falls off on this succulent, I just put it into the soil and all of a sudden I'm getting a bunch of new plants started. And so I'll fill this pot out just by leaves. These leaves are tiny enough that I can just put them onto the soil. My Echeveria Pearl von Nürnberg is another succulent that you can propagate through leaves. All you would do is just get in close to the stem. Sometimes you could break them and you want to just wiggle the leaf off, and you can't have it break or else it won't root, but a nice clean cut will actually shoot out roots. You don't even need soil for these plants to start making little offsets. I've just set them down before and they've created completely new succulents. It is nice to let these dry out a little bit because the surface area is a bit more than these, and sometimes you can get bacteria in the cut, but just give it about a day to dry out and it will start forming roots as well as a new little plantlet. Eventually you can put this onto soil, it will have a new plant, and this old leaf will die off and you'll have a brand new succulent, which is how I created this one. Finally, we have my bunny ear cactus. This one's a bit tough to propagate because you might injure yourself in the meantime. Essentially what you're going to do is take off the pad, let it callus over for about a day or two, and then you can set it on soil again and it will propagate itself. I'll give you a little tip on how to do this actually. You can either just break a pad off or you can use your shears. So simply you would just do a little twist. Wear some gloves, use some tweezers, whatever works best, and then let this callus over. Next, you take the dried pad, put it into the soil, and they have a hard time staying up. So I like to throw a little bit of rocks on top, throw them around. This will help to stand it up, which will mean a higher success rate of it rooting. I've had people have troubles with these rooting in the past because they aren't able to keep them in the same spot and the roots aren't able to grab onto the soil. So I'll just water it in, and honestly, I wouldn't even worry about supplementing humidity or heat. I would just leave this on a windowsill, barely water it, and it will grow roots over time. I've even seen them grow roots without soil. We're gonna take some leaf cuttings as a form of asexual propagation. A typical plant that I like to propagate through leaf cuttings are snake plants. So simply you can just cut anywhere on the plant you'd like and drop it in water. Do another one. So wherever, take a cutting and throw it into some water. Over time, it will eventually grow roots and you'll be able to transfer them. You can also put this into soil if you'd like as well, but I really like to do it in water because you can see the roots growing. Here's an example of some that have been propagating for a while and that have a lot of root growth already. So I could keep it in this water and then transfer it to soil later. What you can also do is you could take multiple cuttings. So you can cut along one leaf a couple of times. And when you put these into soil or water, just make sure to plant the bottom side down or else you'll have roots growing out the top. Another plant that we can propagate through leaf cuttings are actually peperomia. So interestingly enough, all you would have to do is cut along. I'll take one off first. You could do little leaf fragments and you can cut in the middle of the leaf. Woo. Cut off the petiole. And you can take these two pieces and ensure that you stick the cut side into the soil. Next, I'll just water the plant in. I have a perfect example on here. Woo. We have a couple of cut leaves in the soil, which created this plant. One thing to note is that the plant used to have a calcium deficiency, so it wasn't very healthy. I wouldn't use a leaf that isn't doing very well, but I would find the ones that are thriving and cut those, because the one that's lacking calcium will most likely have a harder time rooting. One thing that I wanted to note about propagating this way is that if you have a plant that's variegated, so I previously had a variegated watermelon peperomia. If you propagate the plant through petiole or leaf cuttings, it will lose its variegation. Same with a lot of snake plants. So this is not a variegated snake plant, so it won't lose any of its coloring, but something like this one would revert back to its original form if you did leaf cuttings. We would have to divide it to keep the variegation. Rhizomes are a form of bulb, and so are tubers, so they'll propagate in an alike manner. Here I have two string of hearts. One is variegated and one is not. The variegated form was recently propagated through single node stem cuttings and will eventually create little tubers in the soil, like this plant, at the beginning of each new growth point. Over time they'll get bigger and stronger, as well as have the ability to hold more and more water. This is why I water this plant a lot more than this one, as it hasn't formed these tubers yet. The plant can even handle quite a bit of humidity as it's rooting, but when it's mature, I wouldn't give it much humidity because if the tubers end up in too moist of an environment, they will burst. I've had one that I overwatered burst and it looked and smelled exactly like a rotten egg. Alocasias put off little bulbs that can be propagated as well. You'll find them in the soil. Once I was surprised to find 3 bulbs in my soil when I repotted. This snake plant has been water propagated, so it's grown water roots, and it has primary and secondary roots, and that's usually when I will transfer this to soil. You'll have a little bit of root loss when you transfer it to soil, so I like to set it up with as many roots as possible without them being too developed, because then it can be even more shocking to be transferred to soil. This is a good length. I know a lot of people will wait until a couple of inches long. I really prefer the secondary roots, but go for whatever works best in your opinion. So I would just transfer this to soil. I'm going to wait for the rest of these, but then it will start to grow new offsets and you'll have a brand new plant. A common misconception is that Hoya can be propagated by just the leaf. You'll see heartleaf Hoya around Valentine's Day, and those are just rooted leaves. Because they're just a petiole and the leaf, they don't have a node and they won't keep growing a new plant. So you need to get a piece of the node in order to propagate the plant. This means you're going to at least have a single or a double node cutting when you take a cutting from this plant. They will root along the stems, but you need that node in order for a new plant to continue growing. I've also added more bark to the mix because they enjoy growing on other plants like trees, and they're used to having a barkier, chunkier mix that allows water to drain through it. You can take just a single node cutting right here. Take just this one 45-degree angle, and then this can be placed into the soil. I usually like to take double node cuttings and then take the foliage off the bottom 2 leaves and stick that into the soil, just because it gives it a little bit of structure and that node can focus primarily on root growth. So I will ensure that I have 2 nodes, and I'll cut below the second node at a 45-degree angle, and then I'll take off these 2 bottom leaves. I'll cut on the petiole. There we go. And now I have this bare node we can stick back into the soil. I find it a lot of fun to experiment with different types of cuttings and see what works best for each species. My Monstera deliciosa is getting a little bit too big. I could definitely repot it, but I wanted to propagate it while we are here. So I'm going to take it off of its moss pole. So the plant has been attaching itself to this moss pole for quite a while. but I can pull it out with a little bit of... The internodes are actually quite small on a monstera. I'm gonna take a little cut in between the top two leaves because there's a root right here, and I think that this will grow if I put it into a vessel of water. So I would love to go at 45 degrees, but I can only do it as much as possible. And there we go. If you're taking a top cutting on a plant, it's a really good idea to take the top two, because this new leaf is tender and hasn't matured enough to sustain its life. You will want to have two leaves on this one. All I'm gonna do for this one is just put it in a jar of water and wait over time. And then when it gets secondary roots, I'll transfer it to soil and maybe supplement the humidity to encourage it to root. With the plant that's left, I may just stake it again or do some more cuttings and throw them into water. I would feel more comfortable taking single node cuttings now because they're a lot stronger. I rooted this monstera Adansonii a while ago, and one thing that I wanted to talk about was how new growth will come in with less fenestrations or even quite small because the plant is rooting and it doesn't have enough energy to create really big mature leaves. But once it gets this new immature foliage out, starts photosynthesizing, becomes a bigger plant, then you'll start to see the larger leaves with bigger fenestrations. So just have a little bit of patience. Another interesting way to propagate plants are through rhizomes. So I propagated this little Oxalis triangularis a couple of weeks ago. What you can do is search in the soil and there will be these little rhizomes. So these can be used essentially like seeds. You'll put them into the soil and they'll sprout new growth. You can even keep these dry, send them in the mail to your friends. They can plant them in the soil and create a new plant as well. So I would take this rhizome, put it into the soil, pot it up, and water it. I'll show you what it looks like. You can feel free to be a little bit rough with it. It will look like it's in shock for the first few days, but then over time, you'll notice it bounce right back as it forms roots out of the rhizome, and eventually it will grow new foliage. So, if I look into the soil, do a little bit of digging. Oh, I feel a big one. Then we can see look at this. We've got some rhizomes here, and this holds a lot of water. So this looks like tender foliage, but the plant's actually quite succulent because the rhizomes will help hold on to the water as well. Then I can just transfer this to soil, pot it up, water it in, and we'll have another plant. A couple of other plants that propagate through rhizomes are snake plants. You can use the rhizomes that are underneath the soil, and you don't need any foliage at all. Same with jewel orchids, and ZZ plants will have the same. You can even take a leaf from a ZZ plant and it will grow a rhizome just from that leaf and start an entirely new plant. Sometimes when you're propagating your plants, you can expect some of them to fail. A perfect example is a bunch of these cuttings I took a while ago. As you can see, only one has rooted, and it's rooted sufficiently, while the others have had no active growth. Sometimes these things just happen. You can also encourage it by using more humidity. Heat will encourage root growth as well, but you also need to realize that sometimes it might not work out. We can definitely avoid some problems in order to up your chances of success, but don't feel too bad if you have a couple of losses, especially while you're learning. Something that I wanted to note here is if you take too much of an internode section and you plant it in water or soil, a lot of the times this section will just rot. Essentially anything below the node is really not helping. So I've even found that this has started to rot already, and it may start to work its way up. And roots will form out of the node, even if there's a leaf here.
And look at this, a few weeks later, there are roots coming out of the stem of this Hoya, right where I thought it was rotting. So it's definitely hardy and it's enjoying the leca. This Monstera adansonii has not fared so well. There's way too much of an internodal section at the bottom and it's actually rotting. So I could cut this back and next time not take a cutting with so much of an internodal section. These plants unfortunately can't root along their stems, unlike Hoya.
Something that I wanted to note is how important pot size and pot type is. When you're looking at a plant like a string of hearts, it really doesn't want to be in too wet or too moist of an environment. So naturally, the one that I propagated in a smaller planter with a more porous ceramic pot has done a lot better than the one that's in a more moisture retentive pot. So I found that this would hold way too much water. The leaves would become mushy and they would end up dying from having too much moisture. Alternatively, you can have this variegated string of pearls. I was having troubles with it because it wasn't rooting, and it's because it was staying too dry. It's in a really tiny pot and the surface of the soil would get sun rays beating on top of it and the stems wouldn't be able to root as there wasn't enough moisture. So when I noticed a lot of balding and a lot of drying, I decided to transfer it to this little cloche. I've even had plants inside of humidity domes shoot out adventitious roots that wanted to be on soil, that weren't even on soil, because they had so much humidity they could send out these roots and still have moisture keeping them alive without them touching the soil. So sometimes if you need a bit more of a moisture retentive environment, then getting one of these cloches work very well. You just want to be able to let carbon dioxide replenish by taking the top off every once in a while. And if it ever gets too moist in there, you can take it off, let it dry out a little. Finally, I wanted to show my watermelon peperomia. I have transferred this from water propagation to soil a few weeks ago because it had ample roots. And I saw that this one leaf started to not do very well. It was turning yellow and it's starting to dry up here. But also, this has some new growth forming. So I'm not too worried that this leaf seems like it's on the way out because it seems to have formed new growth anyways. It must have taken the energy from this leaf to create that new growth. And I really think that it's actually well on its way, even though it might look like it's not doing as well as you'd think. I have a plant here, it's a Begonia maculata tamaya, and it looks really parched. You can tell because the leaves are really flimsy and they don't hold their structure. So I decided to put this into this propagation box, which has a lot of moss and also a lid on top of it. So it has maximum humidity, and this should help to remedy the fact that it has lost a lot of the water in its leaves. We're preventing any more water loss from the leaf, and we're encouraging more root growth by encouraging a lot of humidity in here. You know what's interesting to note is even these Hoyas have started to create adventitious roots along their stems because the box is actually so humid.
I hope that you've enjoyed learning about this passion of mine and you find yourself confident, excited, and knowledgeable enough to create many new plants. Feel free to download each PDF and lesson and refer back to it when needed. Use the Houseplant Propagation Key Excel sheet and also experiment with different techniques using this course as a knowledge base.